Ivan Kong had survived enemies, betrayals, and impossible odds, but the one warning that stopped him came from a blind flower girl who quietly whispered, "Please, don't take 7 more steps." The cold evening air drifted through the glass towers of downtown Seoul, carrying the scent of fresh rain, polished concrete, and expensive perfume as luxury sedans lined the entrance of the Grand Hanseong Hotel. Security personnel scanned every face with disciplined precision while executives, celebrities, and politicians stepped onto the crimson carpet beneath a canopy of golden lights. At the center of it all stood Ivan Kong, the Korean Mafia boss whose reputation reached far beyond the city skyline. At 38 years old, he possessed the calm confidence of a man who had learned long ago that real power rarely needed to raise its voice. His charcoal overcoat rested perfectly over an Italian suit tailored with quiet elegance, while every movement suggested complete control. Cameras followed him, yet he barely acknowledged them. His bodyguards maintained a respectful distance, creating an invisible wall no stranger dared cross. To the outside world, he was simply another influential businessman attending an exclusive charity gala. Only a handful of people understood how many dangerous secrets rested behind his composed expression. Less than 50 feet away, sitting beside the marble staircase that overlooked the entrance, was Naomi Brooks. Most visitors never remembered seeing her, though nearly everyone accepted one of her flowers with a passing smile. She arranged small bouquets every evening using delicate white lilies, pale roses, and fresh eucalyptus, guided not by sight but by touch. Naomi had been blind since childhood. Her faded blue eyes never followed movement, yet her fingers recognized every petal as if each flower carried its own fingerprint. She knew the difference between expensive leather shoes and ordinary sneakers simply by the rhythm they made against stone. She could identify perfume brands from several yards away. She even recognized people by the pattern of their breathing before they spoke a single word. Years of living without sight had quietly sharpened every other sense until the world revealed itself through sounds, scents, and tiny vibrations most people never noticed. As Ivan reached the foot of the entrance steps, Naomi suddenly stopped wrapping a bouquet. Her head tilted slightly toward the rooftop across the street. Around her, conversations continued, camera shutters clicked, engines idled, and laughter echoed beneath the hotel canopy. Yet beneath the familiar sounds, something felt wrong. A faint metallic click disappeared almost as quickly as it came. A soft scrape followed several seconds later, high above street level. Then came the nearly invisible scent of machine oil drifting against the evening breeze, completely out of place among expensive cologne and fresh flowers. Naomi's heartbeat quickened. She couldn't explain why every instinct inside her tightened at once, only that the peaceful rhythm surrounding the hotel no longer sounded peaceful. Without hesitation, she stood, carefully navigating the sidewalk with practiced confidence until she reached the invisible line separating ordinary people from the heavily guarded entrance. Before the nearest bodyguard could react, her hand gently found Ivan's sleeve. Her voice remained soft, almost trembling, yet every word carried unusual certainty. "Sir, please don't take 7 more steps." The conversation around the entrance seemed to pause for only a heartbeat before confused eyes turned toward the blind flower girl who had just stopped the most untouchable man in the city. No one moved. The bodyguards reacted first, instinctively placing themselves between Ivan Kong and the young woman whose fingers still lightly rested against the sleeve of his overcoat. One of them gently but firmly guided her hand away, while another stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Naomi did not resist. She simply lowered her hand and tightened her grip around the small basket filled with white lilies. Her breathing remained calm, but inside, uncertainty spread through her chest. Had she misunderstood what she had heard? Had fear convinced her that ordinary sounds were something more? She had spent her entire life trusting the world she built from echoes and scents, yet for the first time those instincts carried consequences that reached far beyond herself. Ivan studied her in silence. Most people met his eyes only briefly before looking away, but Naomi could not see the scrutiny fixed upon her face. There was something unusual about that realization. She had approached him without hesitation, without calculating his influence or reputation, as though she recognized only another human being standing in danger. It was an unfamiliar experience for a man whose every interaction usually revolved around power. The evening breeze shifted again. Somewhere across the avenue, a delivery truck released its air brakes with a sharp hiss. Guests continued walking toward the ballroom entrance, though many slowed their pace to glance curiously at the unexpected interruption. A television reporter lowered her microphone, sensing a story she could not yet explain. The hotel pianist inside the grand lobby continued, playing a gentle jazz melody that drifted through the revolving doors, creating a strange contrast against the growing tension outside. Naomi tilted her head ever so slightly. The same faint metallic rhythm returned. Not louder, not closer, simply different, almost as if someone had stopped moving altogether. Her fingers tightened around the woven handle of the flower basket. She counted quietly inside her mind, following the distant vibrations bouncing between glass buildings and polished stone. Every sound painted invisible shapes around her, and one shape no longer fit the pattern. Ivan noticed the subtle change in her expression. It lasted only a moment, but years of surviving deception had trained him to recognize genuine fear. This was not panic. It was concentration. She was listening to something nobody else seemed able to hear. One of his senior security officers leaned toward him. "Sir, she is probably confused. We should continue inside. The schedule is already running behind." Ivan remained still. Normally, he valued precision above all else. Every public appearance followed an exact timetable measured down to the minute. Delays created unnecessary risks. Yet instead of walking forward, he glanced once toward the broad staircase leading into the hotel before looking back at Naomi. "Why 7?" he asked quietly. Naomi swallowed before answering. "I do not know who you are, sir. I only know what the city sounds like every evening. Tonight, something is missing, and something else should not be there." Her words confused everyone except Ivan. She was not claiming certainty. She was describing observation. There was no dramatic accusation, no plea for attention, only quiet honesty spoken with remarkable conviction. Another soft gust swept across the entrance, carrying with it the fragrance of rain-soaked cedar from a nearby park. Naomi inhaled once, and her expression changed immediately. The unfamiliar scent of machine oil returned, sharper than before, carried for only a second before disappearing into the cold night air. She slowly turned her face toward the rooftops above the opposite side of the boulevard. "Please," she whispered again, almost to herself this time. "Do not take another step." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Even the reporters who had been calling Ivan's name lowered their cameras, sensing that something invisible had shifted. Ivan slowly looked beyond Naomi toward the wide stone walkway leading to the hotel entrance. 7 steps. That was all she had asked him not to take. It sounded irrational, almost impossible, yet every instinct he had developed through decades of surviving deception urged him to question coincidence. He raised one hand slightly, and his security team immediately understood the silent command. Nobody moved forward. Nobody entered the hotel. The carefully rehearsed schedule stopped without explanation. Guests exchanged puzzled glances while event organizers whispered anxiously into their headsets, wondering why the evening's most important guest had frozen outside the entrance. Naomi remained perfectly still. She did not know whether the powerful stranger had believed her or dismissed her entirely. All she knew was that the strange pattern of sounds surrounding the hotel had not returned to normal. Somewhere above, hidden by layers of steel, glass, and evening fog, one faint vibration continued to linger. It reminded her of a violin string stretched too tightly, waiting for the slightest movement. Then, almost without warning, the feeling disappeared. The metallic scent dissolved into the cool night air as quickly as it had arrived. The silence that followed felt different. Lighter. Safer. Naomi released a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding. Ivan noticed the change immediately. "What changed?" he asked quietly. Naomi hesitated before answering. "Whatever did not belong here, it is gone now." Several members of the security detail exchanged skeptical looks. One agent discreetly spoke into his earpiece, requesting a complete inspection of the surrounding buildings and rooftops. Others redirected arriving vehicles away from the main entrance as a precaution. None of the guests understood the reason for the sudden delay, but nobody questioned the decision openly. Ivan's reputation alone was enough to silence complaints. Nearly 15 minutes passed before a senior security officer returned with measured steps. His expression remained professional, but something in his eyes had changed. He leaned close enough that only Ivan could hear. "Sir, our team found fresh signs that someone had recently occupied an observation point overlooking the entrance. Whoever was there left before we arrived. We cannot determine why they abandoned the position so suddenly." Ivan did not answer immediately. His gaze shifted back toward Naomi. She had quietly knelt beside her flower basket once again, carefully straightening a bent lily as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She was not trying to attract attention. She was not asking for gratitude or recognition. In fact, she appeared almost embarrassed by the growing crowd staring at her. That simple detail unsettled Ivan more than the security report. People who lied usually wanted something. Money, influence, protection. This young woman wanted only to return to arranging flowers. One little girl tugged gently on her mother's sleeve before walking over to Naomi. "Excuse me, may I buy one flower?" she asked shyly. Naomi smiled warmly, selecting a small white rose by touch alone before placing it carefully into the child's hands. "This one smells like tomorrow after the rain," she said softly. The little girl laughed, completely unaware that the adults around her had fallen silent once again. Ivan watched the exchange without speaking. For the first time in many years, he found himself wondering whether the rarest kind of strength was not built through fear or authority, but through a heart that remained gentle in a world determined to harden it. The charity gala eventually continued, but nothing about the evening unfolded according to its carefully planned script. Ivan entered the ballroom nearly 20 minutes later than expected, yet his attention remained outside, lingering on the young woman arranging flowers beneath the hotel lights. While distinguished guests applauded speeches and crystal glasses reflected warm chandeliers across the marble floor, his thoughts repeatedly returned to a simple question that refused to disappear. How had she known? He had spent years investing in advanced security, experienced investigators, and highly trained professionals, but none of them had noticed what a blind flower vendor sensed within seconds. Across the ballroom, his chief of security quietly approached and handed him a small folder. The preliminary investigation had already begun. Naomi Brooks, 26 years old. No criminal record. No financial history worth mentioning. She rented a modest apartment above an elderly tailor's shop less than 2 miles from the hotel. Every morning she purchased fresh flowers from the same wholesale market before sunrise, and every evening she returned with whatever remained unsold. The report contained nothing extraordinary.
No suspicious contacts. No hidden assets.
No unexplained travel. Her life appeared remarkably ordinary. "Keep looking," Ivan said calmly. "Not because I believe she has done something wrong. Because I believe we have missed something." The investigation quietly expanded overnight. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed Naomi walking the exact same streets every day with remarkable confidence despite never carrying a cane. She counted intersections by listening to traffic signals. She identified neighborhood stores by familiar scents drifting through open doors. Local shop owners described her as kind, punctual, and impossible to fool. One cafe owner even laughed while speaking with investigators. She remembers customers by their footsteps. "I changed my shoes once, and she asked if I was feeling better because I was walking differently." Another merchant recalled watching Naomi stop a distracted child from stepping into a busy crosswalk simply because she heard the changing rhythm of approaching traffic before anyone else noticed. Piece by piece, an unusual picture emerged. She possessed no mysterious technology and no hidden network of informants. She simply experienced the world differently from everyone around her. The following afternoon, while the investigation continued, Naomi returned to her usual place outside the hotel with fresh bouquets resting neatly inside woven baskets. She had no idea that several discreet security officers observed from a respectful distance. She greeted familiar customers with the same gentle smile, accepted every payment with gratitude, and occasionally gave flowers away to elderly couples who reminded her of her late grandparents. Nothing about her behavior suggested someone seeking attention after the previous night's remarkable encounter. Just before sunset, a little boy accidentally dropped his toy truck onto the sidewalk. Before anyone spoke, Naomi bent down, reached directly toward it without hesitation, and handed it back with a warm smile. "You should hold it tighter," she said softly. "The wheel has been wobbling since you crossed the street." The boy stared in surprise before examining the toy. One small wheel was indeed loose. His mother looked at Naomi with quiet amazement, unable to understand how she had noticed something she herself had missed. From the back seat of a dark sedan parked across the avenue, Ivan watched the scene unfold through the window without stepping outside. For the first time in many years, he realized that true awareness was not always measured by what a person could see. Sometimes it was measured by everything others failed to notice. Ivan had built his life on evidence rather than coincidence, so 3 days later, he decided to search for answers in the only way he trusted. He arrived outside the hotel without the long motorcade, without flashing lights, and without the formal procession that usually surrounded him. Dressed in a simple dark jacket and walking with only one discreet security officer several yards behind, he blended into the evening crowd more easily than anyone expected. Naomi was arranging fresh peonies beside her usual baskets when she smiled gently before he had spoken a single word. "Good evening," she said. "You came alone this time." Ivan stopped. He had not introduced himself, and his footsteps were intentionally unremarkable. "How did you know it was me?" he asked. Naomi tilted her head with a quiet smile. "You breathe more slowly than most people. Your shoes sound expensive, but today you are trying to make them sound ordinary. And your cologne carries cedar instead of citrus. It is the same person." Ivan glanced toward his security officer, who looked equally surprised. He sat down on a nearby stone bench, something he almost never did in public. For the first time in years, nobody approached him asking for favors, business opportunities, or photographs. Naomi simply continued trimming flower stems with careful fingers, giving each bouquet the same attention she would have offered any customer. After a long silence, Ivan asked the question that had followed him since the gala. "Tell me what happened that night." Naomi rested her hands lightly on the basket. "I cannot explain it the way other people expect. I do not predict the future. I only listen." She closed her eyes, although they had never focused on the world around her. Every place has its own rhythm. Cars, wind, doors opening, conversations, air moving between buildings. When something enters that rhythm and does not belong, it feels like hearing one wrong note inside a familiar song. Ivan listened without interrupting. "That evening," she continued softly, "I heard footsteps that were careful in a strange way. Not someone trying to arrive somewhere. Someone trying not to be noticed. Then I smelled machine oil carried by the wind from above. A few moments later, everything became still. Too still. That silence frightened me more than any sound." Ivan looked toward the rooftops surrounding the boulevard. His investigators had described the same observation point discovered after the gala, yet they had reached the conclusion only through hours of analysis. Naomi had sensed the difference in seconds simply by trusting the world she experienced every day. "People always tell me I am remarkable," Naomi said with a quiet laugh. "The truth is much simpler. When you lose one way of understanding the world, you learn to treasure every other one." Before Ivan could answer, an elderly man slowly approached the flower stand carrying a worn leather wallet. He counted several bills with trembling hands before apologizing. "I am afraid I only have enough for one flower today. My wife is in the hospital." Naomi selected the freshest white lily from her basket and quietly placed 2 more beside it. "The other 2 are gifts," she said warmly. "Hospitals always look brighter with 3 flowers instead of 1. The old man's eyes filled with gratitude as he thanked her repeatedly before walking away. Ivan watched every second without speaking. At that moment, he finally understood that the extraordinary part of Naomi Brooks was not her remarkable senses. It was that despite everything life had taken from her, she had never stopped giving kindness away as though she possessed more than enough to share. Over the following week, an unexpected routine quietly took shape. Every evening, just before the city lights reflected across the glass towers, a familiar black sedan stopped a short distance from Naomi's flower stand. Ivan never announced his arrival, and Naomi never pretended to be surprised. She simply smiled as though she had already heard the measured rhythm of his footsteps long before he reached her. Their conversations were never rushed. Sometimes they spoke about flowers that bloomed during different seasons. Sometimes they discussed the sound of rain against old brick buildings compared with modern glass rooftops. Other evenings they simply listened to the city together without saying very much at all. Ivan found the silence strangely comforting. In his world, every quiet moment usually hid negotiation, suspicion, or strategy. Around Naomi, silence carried none of those burdens. It simply existed. One cool afternoon, he decided to ask a question that had been lingering in his thoughts. "Would you be willing to help me understand what you hear?" Naomi tilted her head with quiet curiosity.
How?
Ivan smiled faintly. "Think of it as an experiment." He guided her toward a peaceful courtyard beside a small cultural center where fountains, stone pathways, and maple trees created dozens of gentle echoes. Several members of his security team waited at different locations without speaking. "Tell me where they are," Ivan said. Naomi stood perfectly still. She closed her eyes even though darkness was already familiar to her. For several seconds, she did nothing except breathe. Then she slowly raised one hand. One person is standing beside the fountain. He shifts his weight onto his left foot every few seconds. She turns slightly. Another is leaning against a wooden bench. His jacket brushes the wood whenever the wind changes. She smiled before pointing toward the entrance gate. The third one is pretending to read a newspaper, but he folds the corner of the page every time someone walks by. Ivan looked toward his security officers. Every description was accurate. None of them had made enough noise for an ordinary observer to notice. One officer deliberately changed positions without warning. Naomi immediately turned toward him. Now he is walking closer. He has a slight stiffness in his right knee. The officer stopped in complete astonishment. "She is right," he admitted quietly. "I injured it years ago." Ivan did not applaud or react dramatically. Instead, he found himself appreciating something much deeper. Naomi was not performing remarkable tricks. She was simply paying attention to details everyone else ignored. As they walked back through the courtyard, a sudden breeze scattered several loose flower petals across the stone path. Naomi bent down and carefully gathered them one by one. "They still have a little beauty left," she said softly. "There is no reason to leave them behind." Ivan watched her place the petals beside the roots of a young flowering tree where the wind could no longer carry them away. It was such a small gesture that most people would never have noticed, yet it lingered in his thoughts long afterward. A person who protected fallen petals with the same care she offered strangers could never be measured by ordinary standards. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the skyline, Ivan realized that the greatest lesson Naomi had given him was not about extraordinary senses. It was about noticing quiet things before the rest of the world forgot they mattered. One rainy evening, just as Naomi finished tying the ribbon around her final bouquet, her smile faded almost imperceptibly. Ivan noticed it immediately. During the past several days, he had learned to recognize the smallest changes in her expression. She was not frightened, yet she had become intensely focused, listening to something that existed beyond ordinary conversation. The sidewalks were crowded with office workers carrying umbrellas. City buses released gentle bursts of air at nearby intersections, and rain tapped softly against storefront windows. Everything appeared completely ordinary. Even so, Naomi remained perfectly still. "What do you hear?" Ivan asked quietly. She did not answer right away. Instead, she turned her face slightly toward the opposite side of the boulevard. Her fingers slowly tightened around the handle of the flower basket. "Someone has been walking behind us since you arrived," she finally whispered. Ivan resisted the instinct to look around immediately. Instead, he casually adjusted his jacket while allowing his security team to remain unnoticed. How can you tell? Naomi spoke with calm certainty. Most people change their pace when traffic changes. This person does not. Every time we stop speaking, the footsteps stop too. Every time we move, they move again. Ivan remained silent. Seconds later, one of his security officers discreetly walked farther down the sidewalk before returning several minutes afterward. He gave only the slightest nod. There really had been someone lingering nearby, although the individual disappeared into the evening crowd before anyone could identify them. It was enough to deepen Ivan's concern. The coincidence from the gala no longer felt like an isolated event. Later that night, inside his private office overlooking the illuminated skyline, Ivan gathered his senior advisors. A detailed map of the surrounding district rested across the conference table. Reports from recent days revealed unusual patterns. Several unfamiliar vehicles had appeared near locations Ivan frequently visited. Anonymous inquiries about his public schedule had quietly surfaced. Nothing individually proved malicious intent, yet together they formed a pattern too organized to ignore. One advisor recommended increasing security around Ivan alone. Another suggested relocating future meetings. Ivan listened carefully before speaking. "Expand protection," he said calmly. "Not only around me, around Naomi Brooks as well." The room fell silent. One executive looked genuinely surprised. "Sir, she has no connection to our organization." Ivan looked through the rain-covered window before answering. She became connected the moment she chose to protect someone she did not even know. The order was carried out discreetly. Additional security blended naturally into the neighborhood surrounding Naomi's flower stand without disturbing her daily routine. She remained unaware that plainclothes officers now visited nearby cafes, bookstores, and bakeries throughout the day. Despite these precautions, Naomi sensed a difference almost immediately. When Ivan arrived the following afternoon, she greeted him with the same gentle smile before asking, "Why are there more people pretending not to watch me today?" Ivan could not help smiling in return. "Because I finally listened to your advice. Now it is my turn to make sure you are safe." Naomi lowered her head for a moment, touched by a kindness she had never expected. She had spent most of her life learning to protect herself without asking anyone for help. The idea that someone with immense influence would quietly rearrange his own world simply to protect hers felt almost impossible to believe. As the evening bells from a nearby church echoed across the wet streets, neither of them noticed a figure standing beneath a distant awning, quietly observing the conversation before disappearing once again into the endless rhythm of the city. The following afternoon, Ivan invited Naomi to visit a quiet botanical conservatory on the edge of the city, a place filled with flowing fountains, towering glass ceilings, and thousands of flowering plants from around the world. It was one of the few public places where the constant noise of traffic faded into birdsong and gently moving water. Naomi smiled the moment she stepped inside. "This place sounds peaceful," she said softly as her fingertips brushed the broad leaves of a tropical fern. "The air moves differently here." Ivan walked beside her without speaking for a while. Watching Naomi experience beauty through touch, fragrance, and sound changed the way he viewed the world around him. Flowers he had passed without noticing suddenly carried distinct scents. Water flowing across polished stones produced rhythms he had never taken the time to hear. For the first time in many years, he slowed his pace enough to appreciate details that success had always encouraged him to overlook. As they reached the center of the conservatory, Naomi quietly stopped walking. Her expression changed almost instantly. The peaceful smile faded, replaced by deep concentration. She slowly turned her head toward a distant hallway that connected the main greenhouse to a service entrance rarely used by visitors. Ivan noticed the shift immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Naomi remained silent for several seconds. The fountains continued flowing. Children laughed somewhere beyond the orchids. A gardener pushed a small cart across stone tiles, humming softly to himself. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Yet Naomi listened beyond those familiar sounds until she finally spoke. "There are too many echoes." Ivan frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" She searched for the right words. This building should sound balanced. Today, one hallway is quieter than it should be, as though people are standing still instead of walking through it. They're trying not to make noise, but silence can be as noticeable as sound. Ivan discreetly glanced toward one of his security officers several yards away. Without drawing attention, the officer calmly adjusted his earpiece and began walking toward the hallway Naomi had indicated. Minutes passed. Naomi remained motionless, her breathing steady but attentive. Finally, the officer returned, his expression carefully controlled. "Sir," he said quietly, "we discovered 3 unauthorized maintenance uniforms stored inside a service room near that corridor. No workers are scheduled in that section today. Whoever left them is already gone." Ivan looked back at Naomi. Once again, her instincts had revealed something unusual before anyone else recognized it. No confrontation had occurred. No one had been harmed. Yet another carefully hidden mystery had quietly unraveled because a blind flower girl noticed an absence that everyone else overlooked. As they left the conservatory later that afternoon, dark clouds gathered across the horizon, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of approaching rain through the gardens. Naomi suddenly reached out and lightly touched Ivan's sleeve. "Someone is changing plans," she whispered. Ivan remained perfectly still. "How do you know?" Naomi listened to the wind for another moment before answering. "Because the city no longer sounds like it is waiting. It sounds like someone has decided to hurry." Those quiet words lingered between them as the first raindrops began falling across the glass roof above, and neither of them realized that the days ahead would test not only Naomi's remarkable senses, but also the depth of the trust they had slowly built together. Several weeks later, the city settled back into its familiar rhythm, and for the first time since the unusual evening outside the hotel, Ivan allowed himself to believe that the unseen danger had finally passed. His security team quietly confirmed that the suspicious activity surrounding his movements had disappeared. The unexplained observations, the unfamiliar vehicles, and the strange patterns that had concerned them for days had simply faded away. Life resumed its ordinary pace. Naomi continued arranging flowers every morning before sunrise, greeting neighbors by the sound of their footsteps and recognizing loyal customers by the gentle warmth in their voices. Yet one thing had changed forever. Ivan no longer passed through the neighborhood as an untouchable figure hidden behind tinted windows. He stopped regularly to buy flowers he never truly needed, simply because he had learned that every bouquet carried a conversation worth hearing. One crisp autumn afternoon, he arrived carrying an elegant wooden box instead of his usual quiet smile. Naomi recognized his footsteps immediately. "You are carrying something heavier today," she said with a soft laugh. Ivan placed the box carefully on the small table beside her flowers. "It is a gift," he replied. Naomi slowly opened the lid with curious hands. Inside, she discovered a polished brass plaque mounted upon smooth walnut wood. Her fingertips carefully traced each engraved letter while Ivan quietly read the inscription aloud. "Flowers sold here with dignity." Naomi remained silent for several moments as her fingers rested upon the final word. "Why those words?" she asked almost in a whisper. Ivan looked across the busy sidewalk where strangers paused to admire the colorful bouquets without realizing how many lives had quietly changed beside this simple flower stand. "Because this place reminds people that kindness is never small," he answered. "And dignity should never depend upon wealth, status, or what someone can see." The following week, the city unveiled a newly renovated public flower market only a few blocks away. Local newspapers praised the anonymous benefactor who had funded accessible walkways, improved lighting, and permanent vendor spaces for elderly merchants and people with disabilities. No official statement identified who had made the donation. Only a handful of people knew that Ivan had quietly purchased the entire property before giving every vendor the opportunity to remain there without fear of losing their livelihood. Naomi received the corner space where the morning sunlight lingered longest and the fragrance of fresh blossoms drifted through the air from every direction. She accepted it with the same humility she had shown since the beginning, thanking everyone individually rather than asking who deserved the credit. Months later, visitors often noticed an unusual sight. One of the most influential men in the city would occasionally stand beside a blind flower seller, discussing the scent of spring roses or listening together as children laughed beneath nearby trees. Most people assumed they were old friends. Very few understood that their friendship had begun with 7 simple steps that were never taken. Ivan once believed power came from controlling every situation before it unfolded. Naomi taught him that true wisdom often begins by listening before acting. She never saw his face, yet she recognized his character long before anyone else understood it. And every time the evening breeze carried the fragrance of fresh lilies through the market, the city quietly remembered that the clearest vision does not always come from open eyes. Sometimes it comes from an open heart.